December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor burns. America enters the war, but 2,000 miles away in Kunming, China, something almost impossible is happening. 100 American pilots, volunteers who arrived months before Pearl Harbor, are doing what the entire Chinese Air Force couldn't do for 4 years. They're stopping the Japanese Air Force cold. These men aren't even supposed to be here. They're mercenaries, daredevils, soldiers of fortune, flying obsolete P-40 Warhawks. Planes the U.S. Army Air Corps considered too slow, too outdated for frontline service. The Japanese pilots they're facing have modern Mitsubishi Zeros, faster, more maneuverable, with better climb rates. On paper, the Americans should be dead within a week, but something extraordinary is happening in the skies over China. These American volunteers are shooting down Japanese planes at a rate that military historians still can't fully explain. 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every Flying Tiger lost, a kill ratio that would make even modern fighter pilots jealous. And then Japan does something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. They offer a bounty, not just any bounty. $50,000 for any pilot who can kill a Flying Tiger. In 1941 money, that's 20 times what a pilot makes in a year. In today's money, we're talking about $1 million per head. Think about that for a moment. Japan, a nation that prided itself on the superiority of its pilots, the divine wind of its kamikaze spirit, the invincibility of its Zero fighters, was so desperate to stop 100 American volunteers that they put a price on their heads that would make them instant millionaires. But here's where this story takes an even more incredible turn. Despite flying against overwhelming odds, despite being outnumbered sometimes 30 to 1, despite the massive bounty that would set them up for life, not a single Flying Tiger pilot defected. Not one took the money. Not one switched sides. What happened in those skies over China and Burma between December 1941 and July 1942 would become the most successful air combat record in aviation history. But the real story, the one the history books don't tell you, is how these men became so psychologically terrifying to the Japanese. The Tokyo would rather pay a fortune to eliminate them than face them in combat. Charles Bond was 23 years old when he signed up for the American Volunteer Group, what the world would come to know as the Flying Tigers. He'd been flying mail routes in Texas when a mysterious recruiter approached him with an offer, 3 times his current salary to fly fighters in China. The recruiter didn't mention they'd be flying against the Japanese. This was April 1941. America was still at peace. Bond arrived in Rangoon, Burma in September 1941, along with 99 other American pilots. They'd resigned their commissions from the Army, Navy, and Marines. Technically, they were civilians now. Technically, they were just instructors hired to train Chinese pilots. But everyone knew why they were really there. Their commander was Claire Lee Chennault, a tactical genius who'd been forced into retirement from the U.S. Army Air Corps. Because his ideas about fighter combat were considered too radical, Chennault believed that properly trained pilots in inferior aircraft could defeat superior planes through tactics and teamwork. The top brass scoffed. They were about to stop laughing. The first thing Chennault did was study the Zero, not from intelligence reports or technical manuals. Those didn't even exist yet. He studied them by watching them slaughter Chinese pilots. For 3 years. He'd observed every Japanese tactic, every strength and every weakness, and he found something remarkable. The Zero was indeed faster and more maneuverable than the P-40. But it achieved this superiority through one critical compromise: armor. The Zero had almost no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built for offense, not defense. One good burst from the P-40's 650 caliber machine guns, and a Zero would explode like it was made of kindling. But you had to hit it first, and to hit it, you had to completely reimagine aerial combat. Chennault threw out the rulebook. Forget dogfighting, forget one-on-one combat, forget everything the military academies taught. Instead, he created something revolutionary: dive and zoom tactics. The Flying Tigers would attack from above at maximum speed, fire one devastating burst, then use their superior diving speed to escape before the Zeros could react. Never turn with a Zero, never try to outclimb one. Strike and fade, slash and burn. More importantly, Chennault insisted on something that went against every fighter pilot's instinct: teamwork over glory. Flying Tigers never flew alone. They attacked in pairs, one pilot shooting while his wingman protected his tail. If a pilot broke formation to chase personal glory, Chennault would ground him. In some cases, he sent them home. Robert Neal was leading a patrol on December 23, 1941, when they spotted a formation of Japanese bombers heading for Kunming. 10 Mitsubishi Ki-21 bombers escorted by 20 Zeros. The Flying Tigers had 15 P-40s in the air. By conventional military wisdom, they should have avoided the engagement. The Zeros alone outnumbered them. But Neal remembered Chennault's training. Height is life, speed is everything. He led his squadron up to 15,000 feet, then rolled over into a 70-degree dive. The P-40s screamed down at over 400 miles per hour, faster than the Zeros could possibly react. The first pass was devastating. 3 bombers exploded instantly. 4 Zeros spiraled down in flames before their pilots even knew they were under attack. The Flying Tigers used their diving speed to zoom back up to altitude, then dove again and again and again. In 12 minutes, it was over. 6 bombers and 4 Zeros destroyed. Not a single Flying Tiger was even damaged. The Japanese formation fled back to their base in complete disorder. But it was what happened next that truly terrified the Japanese. The surviving bomber crews reported something that seemed impossible. The American planes had shark faces painted on their noses, huge, gaping mouths with rows of sharp teeth. In the split second before the attack, Japanese pilots saw these demon faces rushing at them at impossible speeds. It was psychological warfare at its most primitive and effective level. Within days, Japanese pilots were reporting nightmares about the shark-face planes. Some refused to fly missions into areas where Flying Tigers were known to operate. The Japanese military, which prided itself on the fearlessness of its warriors, had a morale, a confidence crisis. And it was being caused by just 100 American volunteers. Tokyo's response was swift and unprecedented. On January 15, 1942, Radio Tokyo announced a bounty, 50,000 US, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Pearl Harbor is ablaze, and America is thrown headfirst into the raging inferno of World War II. But 2,000 miles across the Pacific, in Kunming, China, something unbelievable is unfolding. 100 American pilots, daredevils who arrived months before that infamous day, are accomplishing what the entire Chinese Air Force couldn't manage in 4 long years. They're stopping the seemingly unstoppable Japanese Air Force dead in its tracks, and the Japanese were getting desperate. So desperate, in fact, that they announced a bounty of 50,000 US dollars for any person who killed or captured a Flying Tiger pilot. To put this in perspective, the average American pilot made about $2,400 a year in 1941. This bounty was literally 20 years' salary for taking out one enemy pilot. The announcement was broadcast in English, clearly meant for the Flying Tigers to hear. It was both a compliment and a psychological weapon. Japan was saying, "We fear you so much. We'll make you rich if you'll just stop flying against us." But something remarkable happened. Not only did no Flying Tiger pilot defect, but the bounty actually made them fight harder. Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, who would later become one of the most decorated Marine pilots in history, was drinking in a bar in Kunming when he heard about the bounty. His response, "Well, boys, looks like we just got more valuable. Let's make them pay even more." The next day, Boyington shot down 2 Zeros and damaged a 3rd. David Lee "Tex" Hill was another Flying Tiger who took the bounty personally. A Navy dive bomber pilot before joining the AVG, Hill had a reputation for being absolutely fearless. When he heard about the $50,000 price on his head, he painted a message on the side of his P-40, "Come and collect." On January 23, 1942, Hill was part of a 3-plane patrol when they spotted a formation of 30 Japanese aircraft, 10 bombers and 20 fighters, 3 against 30. Any rational pilot would have radioed for reinforcements and shadowed the formation. Hill attacked. Using Chanot's diving tactics, the 3 Flying Tigers tore into the Japanese formation like wolves among sheep. Hill personally shot down 3 aircraft in 4 minutes. His wingman got 2 more. The Japanese formation scattered in complete chaos, jettisoning their bombs over empty jungle and fleeing back to Thailand. When Hill landed, his crew chief counted 47 bullet holes in his P-40. Hill hadn't even noticed he'd been hit, but the psychological impact went deeper than just the combat success. The Flying Tigers were doing something that shattered Japanese military culture at its core. In the Japanese military code of Bushido, surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Death was preferable to capture. Japanese pilots carried no parachutes in the early war because bailing out was considered cowardly. Yet here were American daredevils, men fighting purely for money, not for emperor or country, who refused to be bought even when offered life-changing wealth. The Japanese military leadership couldn't understand it. If these Americans were just mercenaries, why couldn't they be purchased? If they were fighting for money, why wouldn't they take more money to stop? The answer revealed something about American psychology that the Japanese had fundamentally misunderstood. Yes, the Flying Tigers were being paid, but they weren't fighting for money. They were fighting for something the Japanese military code couldn't account for: individual choice. Every Flying Tiger had volunteered. They'd chosen to be there. They'd chosen to resign their commissions, travel halfway around the world, and fight in obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. No one had ordered them. No emperor commanded their loyalty. They were there because they wanted to be there. Robert Smith, a Flying Tiger from Oklahoma, explained it years later. "The money was nice, sure, but we were there to prove something. We were there to show that American pilots, given the chance, were the best in the world. You can't buy that. You can't put a price on that kind of pride." The bounty had another unintended consequence. It made the Flying Tigers celebrities. War correspondents from around the world descended on Kunming to write about the American pilots with prices on their heads. Time magazine put them on the cover. Hollywood started planning movies before the war was even over. The Flying Tigers became the first American heroes of World War II, even though technically they weren't even in the American military. This fame translated directly into tactical advantages. Chinese civilians, inspired by the Flying Tiger's success, created an early warning network that stretched for hundreds of miles. Whenever Japanese aircraft took off, Chinese spotters would radio ahead, giving the Flying Tigers sometimes an hour's warning of incoming attacks. The Japanese couldn't move without the Tigers knowing about it. Eric Schilling was scrambled on February 6, 1942, with intelligence that a large Japanese formation was heading for Kunming. 50-plus aircraft, Schilling had exactly 6 P-40s available. The smart move would have been to evacuate the base and preserve the aircraft. Instead, Schilling remembered something Chanot had taught them. The Japanese military mind cannot accept the illogical. Use this against them. Schilling took his 6 P-40s and flew directly at the Japanese formation, not diving from above, not using strike and fade tactics, just flying straight at 50 enemy aircraft. Like he had 50 planes of his own behind him, the Japanese formation leader was so convinced this had to be a trap. No one would attack 50 aircraft with 6 unless they had hidden reinforcements, that he ordered his entire formation to turn back. 50 aircraft fled from 6 P-40s without a shot being fired. When word of this reached Tokyo, the military leadership increased the bounty to $100,000. But by then, it was too late. The psychological damage was done. Japanese pilots were refusing missions. Some were developing mysterious illnesses that kept them grounded whenever flying tigers were reported in their sector. The mighty Japanese Air Force, which had terrorized China for 4 years, was being psychologically destroyed by 100 American volunteers. But the real genius of the flying tigers went beyond just tactics or psychological warfare. They were proving something that military strategists had argued about for years, that technology alone doesn't win wars. The human element, training, tactics, morale, and most importantly, the reason why someone fights, matters more than having the best equipment. The P-40 Warhawk was inferior to the Zero in almost every measurable way. It was slower, less maneuverable, had a lower ceiling, and worse climb rate. But in the hands of pilots who understood its strengths and their enemies' weaknesses, it became a zero killer. By March 1942, the kill ratio was becoming embarrassing for Japan. Official Japanese records discovered after the war showed they were losing 14 aircraft for every flying tiger shot down. Some individual flying tigers had personal kill ratios of 20-1 or better. Charles Older, a former Marine pilot from Los Angeles, had a streak in March where he shot down 11 Japanese aircraft in 10 days without taking a single hit. When a reporter asked him how he did it, Older replied, "Chanot taught us to fight smart, not fair. The Japanese expected us to fight with honor. We fought to win." This attitude, pragmatic, results-oriented, utterly without regard for traditional military courtesy, drove the Japanese command structure absolutely insane. In their world, warfare had rules, codes, proper ways of doing things. The flying tigers ignored all of it. When Japanese pilots would waggle their wings in the traditional fighter pilot salute before combat, the flying tigers would use that moment of ceremony to shoot them down. When Japanese formations would maintain perfect military bearing, the tigers would attack from unexpected angles. When Japanese pilots would pursue individual glory, the tigers would gang up on them, 3-1. It wasn't honorable. It wasn't sporting. It was devastatingly effective. Perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect was the tigers' use of psychological operations. Beyond just the shark teeth, they would deliberately leave Japanese pilots alive but damaged, forcing them to limp home and report their defeat. They would shoot up aircraft on the ground, but leave just enough functional for the Japanese to see what they'd lost. They would sometimes toy with Japanese formations, making fake attack runs to force them to jettison their bombs over empty jungle. Robert Sandell, leading a patrol on April 10, 1942, encountered a single Japanese reconnaissance plane. Rather than simply shoot it down, Sandell had his flight surrounded. flying in perfect formation with the terrified Japanese pilot for nearly 20 minutes. They would pull alongside, wave, point their guns at him, then back off. The Japanese pilot was so psychologically shattered that when he finally landed, he had to be carried from his aircraft. The pilot never flew again. His report of the incident spread through the Japanese air forces in Burma like wildfire. The Americans weren't just defeating them, they were playing with them. By May 1942, the situation had become critical for Japan. They were losing the air war in China, and worse, they were losing it to a numerically inferior force of daredevils. The damage to Japanese military prestige was becoming catastrophic. Something had to be done. The Japanese High Command made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They began withdrawing their best pilots and aircraft from the China theater. They couldn't afford to keep losing experienced pilots to the Flying Tigers. These pilots were needed for the expanding war in the Pacific, but this created a vicious cycle. With their best pilots gone, the Japanese losses to the Flying Tigers got even worse. Inexperienced Japanese pilots flying against the now battle-hardened Tigers were being slaughtered. The kill ratio climbed to 16-1, then 18-1. John Petach was leading a flight of 4 P-40s on May 4, 1942. When they encountered a formation of 27 Japanese aircraft, the smart money would have been on the Japanese. 27 versus 4 should have been a massacre. 15 minutes later, 8 Japanese aircraft were burning wrecks on the jungle floor. The remaining 19 were fleeing in complete disorder. Not one P-40 had been seriously damaged. When news of this battle reached Tokyo, there were demands for court-martials. How could 27 aircraft fail to defeat 4? The surviving Japanese pilots were interrogated for hours. Their story was consistent, but unbelievable. The American pilots flew like they were invincible. They attacked without hesitation, without fear, like they knew they couldn't be shot down. The truth was simpler, but even more damaging to Japanese morale. The Flying Tigers had become so confident in their tactics and their psychological edge that they genuinely believed they were invincible. And in warfare, the side that believes it will win usually does. But the real psychological masterstroke came in June 1942. The Flying Tigers were scheduled to be disbanded and absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Forces. Chanot had one last operation in mind, something that would cement the Tigers' psychological victory forever. He deliberately leaked false intelligence that the Flying Tigers were being reinforced. By 300 additional pilots, radio transmissions were sent in codes. The Japanese were known to have broken. Fake arrival ceremonies were staged at airfields. Chinese newspapers ran stories about the massive American reinforcement. The Japanese took the bait completely. They pulled even more aircraft and pilots out of China to meet this imaginary threat elsewhere. In reality, the Flying Tigers were down to fewer than 50 operational pilots and 30 aircraft. On July 4, 1942, the American Volunteer Group was officially disbanded. In 7 months of combat, they had destroyed 296 confirmed Japanese aircraft, with another 153 probably destroyed. They had lost just 14 pilots in combat, but the numbers don't tell the whole story. The Flying Tigers had done something that all the military might of China couldn't do. In 4 years of war, they had broken the Japanese air forces psychologically. They had proven that the Japanese were not invincible, that their aircraft were not superior, that their pilots were not the best in the world. More importantly, they had done it as volunteers, as individuals who chose to fight, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to. This was incomprehensible to the Japanese military mindset, and ultimately contributed to their fundamental misunderstanding of American resolve in the wider war. The bounty on the Flying Tigers was never collected, not because pilots weren't shot down, 14 were killed in combat, but because the Japanese could never capture them alive. The Flying Tigers had made a pact. No one would be taken prisoner. They would fight to the last bullet and save the final one for themselves, if necessary. But it never came to that. The psychological victory was so complete that even when Flying Tigers were shot down over Japanese-held territory, local Chinese civilians would risk their lives to rescue them. The Tigers had become more than just pilots. They had become symbols of resistance. General Hideki Tojo himself would later admit that the Flying Tigers had been worth more than a division of regular troops, not because of the planes they shot down, but because of what they did to Japanese morale. They proved that Japan could be beaten. And they proved it when Japan seemed unstoppable. The $50,000 bounty, that desperate attempt to buy victory when military force had failed, became a symbol of Japanese frustration and fear. It was the moment when the Empire of Japan admitted that 100 American volunteers in obsolete aircraft were worth more than money could buy. Years after the war, a former Japanese ace named Saburo Sakai was asked about the Flying Tigers. His response was telling. We could not understand them. They fought like daredevils, but died like samurai. They had no emperor, no homeland to defend, yet they would not surrender. They were offered fortunes and refused. What kind of men were these? What god did they serve? We never found the answer, and that, more than their tactics, more than their victories, is why they terrified us. The story doesn't end there. The psychological impact of the Flying Tigers extended far beyond their 7 months of combat. When the U.S. Army Air Forces took over operations in China, they found that Japanese pilots had developed an almost superstitious fear of shark-mouthed P-40s. Even when painted on different aircraft types, the shark mouth would cause Japanese formations to hesitate, sometimes to flee without engaging. The bounty system Japan had created backfired spectacularly. By putting such a massive price on American pilots' heads, they had inadvertently created legends. Every Flying Tiger knew he was worth $50,000 dead to the enemy. Instead of demoralizing them, it became a point of pride. They wore it like a badge of honor. Robert Prescott, who would later found Flying Tiger Airlines, kept a copy of the Japanese bounty notice in his flight jacket for the rest of the war. When asked why, he said, "That piece of paper was worth more than any medal. It was the enemy admitting we had beaten them so badly. They couldn't face us in fair combat anymore." The tactical lessons learned from the Flying Tigers revolutionized American air combat doctrine. The dive and zoom tactics Chanot developed became standard training for U.S. pilots throughout the Pacific War. The emphasis on teamwork over individual glory became embedded in American fighter doctrine. The psychological warfare techniques, from the shark mouths to the deliberate terror tactics, were refined and employed throughout the war. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the Japanese military psyche. The Flying Tigers had shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility at a crucial moment. They proved that Western pilots, despite flying inferior aircraft, could not only match, but dominate Japanese aviators. This revelation spread throughout the Pacific, emboldening Allied pilots and demoralizing Japanese ones. A captured Japanese document from late 1942 revealed that pilot training schools were using the Flying Tigers as a case study in what they called American unpredictability. The document warned that Americans did not follow logical military patterns. that they would attack when outnumbered, retreat when winning, and always do the unexpected. This fear of American unpredictability, born from 100 volunteers in China, would haunt Japanese military planning for the rest of the war. The financial aspect of the bounty also revealed something crucial about the difference between American and Japanese military culture. To the Japanese, the idea that soldiers fought for money was dishonorable. They assumed daredevils could be bought because they had no higher loyalty. But the Flying Tigers proved that American volunteers, even when technically daredevils, fought for something beyond money or orders. They fought for the challenge, for their comrades, and for the simple fact that they chose to be there. This voluntary aspect terrified Japanese commanders more than any tactical innovation. How do you defeat an enemy who fights not because they must, but because they want to? How do you break the morale of men who treat a $50,000 bounty on their heads as a joke? The answer was, you couldn't. And Japan learned this lesson from 100 American volunteers in obsolete aircraft over the skies of China. The Flying Tigers didn't just win battles. They won a psychological war that contributed to Japan's eventual defeat. In the end, the $50,000 bounty stands as one of history's most spectacular military failures. Not only did it fail to eliminate a single Flying Tiger through defection or betrayal, but it elevated them from daredevil pilots to legendary warriors. It transformed a small group of volunteers into symbols of American determination and ingenuity. The last surviving Flying Tiger, Frank Losonsky, died in 2020 at age 99. To his final days, he kept a framed copy of the Japanese bounty notice on his wall. When asked about it shortly before his death, he smiled and said, $50,000. That's what they thought we were worth. But they couldn't afford us. Some things, you see, just can't be bought. The Flying Tigers proved that in warfare, the human spirit matters more than technology, that volunteers can outfight conscripts, and that psychological dominance can be worth more than numerical superiority. They proved it in 7 months over China, with a price on their heads, and the odds stacked against them, and not one of them took the money. Today, when military historians study asymmetric warfare and psychological operations, they still reference the Flying Tigers. How did 100 volunteers in obsolete aircraft force an empire to put bounties on their heads? How did they achieve kill ratios that modern fighter pilots with advanced technology struggle to match? How did they break the will of an enemy that prided itself on warrior spirit? The answer lies not in the P-40 Warhawk specifications, or even in Chennault's revolutionary tactics. It lies in the psychological triumph of free men choosing to fight against tyranny, proving that the human spirit, when properly motivated and led, can overcome any technological disadvantage. The Japanese bounty on the Flying Tigers wasn't just a military footnote. It was the moment when an empire admitted that money couldn't buy what Americans gave freely: courage, determination, and the will to win against impossible odds. $50,000 in 1941, it was a fortune. In 2024, it would be over $1 million. But for the Flying Tigers, it wasn't enough. It would never be enough, because they weren't fighting for money. They were fighting to prove that free men, volunteers who chose their own battles, could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful. And they did, one shark-mouthed P-40 at a time. Thank you for watching. If you found this story of American courage and determination inspiring, please consider using the Super Thanks button below this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these untold stories of World War II to light. These weren't just pilots. They were volunteers who changed the course of history. And if you have a family member who served in World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater, please share their story in the comments. These heroes deserve to be remembered. Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more incredible stories of American innovation and courage in World War II. Next week, get ready to hear about something incredible. We're diving into the story of how American tank crews stumbled upon a game-changing modification. This tweak had German Tiger tanks retreating without firing a single shot. I repeat, without firing a single shot. Trust me, you absolutely won't want to miss that.